Okay, so thank you all for coming. I thought I would begin by just sort of discussing the idea I had in mind when I proposed the special issue. So next slide, please. So one way to think about why causal inference is hard is represented by this picture here. And effectively, so from an ex ante perspective, many things can happen, but from an ex post perspective, of course, only one thing did happen, and that's what's available for observation. The sort of counterfactual state of the world is by definition unobservable, and that's essentially, in a nutshell, the problem. Next slide, please. So for example, as a kind of a silly example, I grew up here, a really hot and sticky place, and I worry about being hot a lot, which is pretty stupid because I've spent the last 16 years in Switzerland, Germany, and England. But nonetheless, it's often made me wonder if you grow up in a place that has extreme weather, do you become sort of overly sensitized to that specific type of weather? Next slide, please. So I wonder, for example, if I had grown up here, what would I be like? We'll never know, of course, but we can think about different proxies for this counterfactual version of Charles and ask ourselves, how valid are they? May they be or may they not be in terms of causal inference? Next slide, please. So experiments, of course, solve this problem for us with random treatment assignment, and that's very powerful in terms of causal inference, but the cost often comes in terms of a setting, especially for behavioral researchers, a setting that can be highly artificial and of questionable external validity for that reason. And then, of course, in the evolutionary human sciences, many questions just don't admit experimental approaches. Next slide, please. And that brings us really to causal inference more broadly. So for good or bad, I'm not an economist, but for good or bad, I spend an inordinate amount of time hanging around with economists, especially behavioral economists. And many years ago, I noticed that the field had changed. Experiments were becoming much less common, but that didn't mean that researchers had given up on causality. Instead, they had become, very clever at designing causal identification strategies for observational studies. And design is really the right word. I'm talking about something that in many cases is more subtle than simply ensuring you have the right set of controls on the right-hand side, that they were really designing the studies. And the bulk of the discussion in a seminar, for example, would be about the design of the identification strategy. Perhaps less positively, in the last several years, I've also participated in many interdisciplinary workshops with some mix of economists and evolutionary researchers. And I felt that usually at least once in these events, there's been at least one unproductive conversation about causality that goes something like the following. The economists will say something about causality that will be perceived as maybe aggressive or a bit dogmatic by the others, and that will lead to, in frustration, let's say, a dismissive flourish and some crack about instrumental variables, something like that. And I always thought, okay, this is unfortunate in every possible way, because yes, it's true, economists have their conventions. As near as I can tell, they prefer the potential outcomes framework over graphs when thinking about causality. And then they have their toolkit, of course, IV, diff and diff, RDD, blah, blah, blah. But in the end, who really cares about all that? I think what really matters is that they have developed a kind of a scientific culture in which they're exceedingly explicit, even excruciatingly explicit about their causal identification strategy. And they have a shared understanding of what the rules are. And I found myself thinking, maybe the evolutionary human sciences could use more of that. And in a nutshell, that was it. And I proposed the special issue for that reason. Next slide. And Ruth Mace liked the idea. I'd like to thank her for that, and Cambridge University Press. I'd also like to thank Joseph Bulbuli and James Holland-Jones for helping out as guest editors. And I invite you to check out the full issue on the journal website. I was really surprised by the diversity of submissions and the different ways that people were thinking about causality in the evolutionary human sciences. But that's really the point in the way, to sort of precipitate an explicit discussion about how we as researchers in the evolutionary human sciences want to think about causal inference. And with that, thank you again. And I'd like to turn it over to the first speaker, Dan Smith.
Great. Thanks, Charles. And hi, everyone. Nice to see so many people here. So yeah, I've got the unenviable task of giving the first talk here. So my paper is a rather boring title of Exploring Causality from Observational Data, an example whether religiosity promotes cooperation. Next slide, please. Essentially, this paper is a little bit of a Trojan horse. So ostensibly, it's about kind of religion and cooperation, which should hopefully entice some evolution and religion folk to kind of pay a bit of notice. But really, kind of the main aim of it is to sneak in some kind of causality and sensitivity analyses. So I'm kind of by training an evolutionary anthropologist, but for the past 6 or 7 years, I've been hanging out with epidemiologists who also love kind of causality, but more from a kind of a DAG-based perspective. So I've kind of drunken some of their causal Kool-Aid. And yeah, the aim was just to kind of give a bit of a pass some of this back to this lovely evolutionary folk. So next slide, please. So hopefully most of you are kind of at least broadly familiar with DAGs, so directed acyclic graphs. These are wonderful tools which kind of represent all of our assumptions about the kind of the causality and the data generating mechanisms involved in the data that we have and we collect. And they're really useful just for making our assumptions super clear and then for kind of informing our choice of analyses as well. So say we want to know the causal effect of an exposure on an outcome. So again, here looking at, say, religion on cooperation, we then need to think about what the other kind of variables involved are. So for instance, we might have something which is a confounder. So this is a variable which causes the exposure and the outcome. And we want to adjust for these because otherwise there's an open backdoor path between the exposure and the outcome through the confounder, which is not part of the causal effect we're interested in. So we want to kind of adjust for this in any of our analyses. We can also have mediators. So these are variables which are caused by the exposure, which in turn cause the outcome. And so these are part of the mechanism by which the exposure kind of causes the outcome. So we don't want to adjust for this, else we could get a biased causal effect. And finally, we have the freaky voodoo that is colliders. These are variables which are caused by the exposure and the outcome. And we want to avoid adjusting for these as well, because you can get collider bias, which can induce spurious correlations between our exposure and outcome, again, leading to bias and a biased causal estimate. So we can kind of think of our different variables kind of into these categories, and then we can design our analyses kind of based on this. So adjust for confounders, don't adjust for mediators, and don't adjust for colliders. Next, please. So this is kind of like the general kind of setup for kind of using DAGs for kind of trying to get causal inference from kind of basic observational research, but our assumptions really can be wrong. So we can use sensitivity analysis to try and explore how different causal assumptions might impact results. For instance, a variable we've measured, we may not be sure whether it's actually a confounder or a mediator, or it could be both. So in the example of religion and cooperation, something like marital status could potentially be both. It could be a confounder, so those who are married are more likely to be religious and more likely to cooperate, but it could also be a mediator. So people who are religious are more likely to get or remain married, which could then in turn cause cooperation. So there's some uncertainty here. So we can explore different models based on these different causal assumptions to see whether this impacts our results. There may also be unmeasured confounding, so there'll be some variables which we just didn't measure or don't have data on, which could again be confounders. So we want to kind of see how much this might impact our results. And there's also potentially a risk of selection bias as well, because there might be missing data. And if this is related to the exposure and the outcome, this missing data essentially acts as a collider, which we kind of condition or stratify on, which can then lead to collider bias and again, kind of bias in our results. So in this paper, I explored again, using just the motivating example of religion and cooperation, and just trying to explore these different sensitivity analyses, which could be used kind of by others as well, just as a kind of nice kind of applied example of how to apply these methods. So next, please. So in the first sensitivity analysis, we explored different confounder sets. So we had three exposures. We had religious belief, affiliation, and religious attendance. So in the first kind of confounder set, we explored variables which we believed were only confounders. So these are things like age, which can only really plausibly be a confounder, against kind of the same variables, but including variables which could be potential mediators. So again, things like I mentioned, like marital status. And as you can see here, there's not really much difference between these confounding sets. So regardless of our causal assumptions, it doesn't seem to make too much difference in terms of our observed variables. And you can see that from the results here, it's only really religious attendance that has any kind of real association with cooperation, here measured as donating blood, although, the confidence intervals are kind of brushing the null, so it's not particularly kind of like convincing effect. Next, please. Next, we explored unmeasured confounding. So there are a range of different sensitivity analyses you can do to explore this. And this rather confusing looking graph. Basically, it simulates a range of different unmeasured confounders and their kind of correlation with the exposure and the outcome to see how much is necessary to basically move the observed estimate towards null. And that's what the red line here represents. And you can see that if there's an unmeasured confounder which has about a correlation of 0.15 with the exposure and 0.1 with the outcome, this is enough to basically completely remove our effect. So not exactly a huge amount of unmeasured confounding is necessary to completely remove this effect. And the red kind of variables here are like the observed benchmarks from the observed variables. So you can see that basically if a variable has about the same association with the outcome and exposure as having a degree level education, this is enough to completely eradicate the effect that we observed. So again, kind of small levels of unmeasured confounding could plausibly explain away the association. Next, please. We also had like missing data in lots of our variables, which is really common. So we used multiple imputation to try and kind of remove the missing data and remove any potential selection bias, but this didn't really seem to have much impact on our results either. So suggests that selection bias isn't necessarily impacting our results. Next, please. So what can we summarize from this? Is there evidence for a causal relationship? For religious belief and identity, there doesn't really appear to be much going on. For religious attendance, there seems to be stronger evidence, but it's still quite weak and could plausibly be due to unmeasured or residual confounding. Again, this is more just kind of like a toy example just to show these methods in practice, so I really wouldn't take these kind of too seriously, and there are many other limitations such as measurement error in terms of measuring religion and measuring blood donation, issues of reverse causality, so potentially people who are cooperative might be more likely to be religious, for instance, and issues of generalizability, etc. But hopefully it's still kind of like an interesting kind of motivating example. Next, please. Oh, and I'll just leave you and end with a haiku, which you can read yourself if you want. So thanks for listening, and yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dan. Lovely haiku. And thanks everybody for being here. I'm Cyril Lonati, associate professor at Neoma Business School in France, and I will tell you a little bit more about our paper with Raphael Aliv and Charles from University of Lausanne. Paper titled Identifying Culture as Cause, Challenges and Opportunities. Casey, just a small note for you. I have, some animations in my slides. So for the smoothest flow, if you could allow all the animations to flow when I say next, that probably is the most efficient way of going through. So let's move to the next slide. And basically, getting back to the article, our idea here is to ask a deceptively simple question, which is actually huge, and how to make causal claims, especially when it comes to culture. If you ask to a social scientist or to an epidemiologist, what they will probably respond to this question is an experimental approach. Randomized controlled trial is the golden standard on how to make causal claims. Next animations, please. Basically, the idea that you probably all know is that you take a sample from a population of interest and you then split the sample randomly into parts. Next, please. You give to one of the groups a medicine or whatever treatment you're interested in. And if we flow to the next animation, we give to the other group a placebo, a candy, or at least a medicine that is supposed to work less well than the one you give to the treatment group. Now, if these two groups are large enough, And if you really select them at random, what will usually happen is that these two groups will be very similar to each other. So if we move to the next animation, you can credibly say that the only reason for why they differ on average is the treatment, is the receipt of the treatment. Hence, you can measure, if somebody is on average in the treated group healthier, happier, whatever you want, compared to the placebo, compared to control. Okay, if we move to the next slide, all this thing looks incredibly simple and super intuitive. The problem is that if you talk to a cultural evolutionary scientist, that's really something that we cannot usually do. Culture is not as simple as a pill. You cannot randomize people to receive culture. It's even sometimes hard to really kind of like define exactly what culture is. And even if we could do so, the very idea of randomizing it to people would pose conceptual, ethical, logistical, and financial limitations that are obvious. The provocation of the paper is, however, that thinking about culture in this experimental framework, if you wish, can bring some advantages. Next slide, please. Basically, the idea that we want to really push is that we can look for approximations of this ideal randomized controlled trial where culture will not be randomized by the experimenter. That's definitely something that is not possible, at least in general. But we can think about situations, approximations of this ideal, where culture is as if randomly assigned to individuals or to groups in the field, thanks to processes that are, very idiosyncratic and due to maybe natural conditions or any other form of as if random variation. So that is really the idea we try to push. And what we do in the article is to review 3 strategies that we believe have some potential. We present these strategies, and then we discuss some examples in published literature using this knowledge from the multidisciplinary team. I mean, I am a business researcher, Charles is an evolutionary human scientist, an applied evolutionary scientist, if you wish, and Raphael Aliv is an economist. So we try to really, come up with examples from our own fields to try to inform the cultural evolutionary one. Next slide, please. The 3 strategies that we review are regression discontinuity, something that the next presenter, Lisa, will talk more about, so will not take much time. But here the idea of regression discontinuity is to rely on a natural experiment. That is, variation that is generated by a cutoff, a geographical cutoff, quite literally, that sharply separates two cultural groups. Now, under some condition, if you're able to find in the field some of these cutoffs, well, then you can rely on this cutoff as a sort of as if random allocator of culture to different people that live in otherwise very similar geographical, institutional, and economic conditions. Next slide, please. The second strategy that we discuss is instrumental variable estimation, something that we could think of as a sort of a surrogate experiment. An instrumental variable is a variable that is random and that causes culture, without, however, directly affecting the outcome of interest. The intuition here is something like this. We might not be able to randomize culture, but maybe there are some as if random causes of culture that we can use as a sort of a nudge, that we can use, if you wish, as sort of a randomizer of different groups or individuals into cultural groups. And if we're able to assume that this random nudge doesn't affect the outcome of interest directly, well, then it's a bingo, and we can isolate a causal effect of culture. Next slide, please. The last strategy, which is really not a formalized identification strategy proper, but is more of a empirical approach, is something that we call epidemiological approach. Not we, actually, the literature calls it epidemiological approach, really. And it's a strategy that tries to mimic a common garden experiment. If there are any biologists in the audience, they might know what I'm talking about. The idea here is to study culturally heterogeneous individuals that live, however, in the same location. The classic example is migrants and their descendants. These are individuals that, of course, are not randomized into living into another country, But they create an interesting empirical situation because they're individuals that usually belong to a cultural group and have some cultural traits that are not perhaps typical of the place, of the location we're living. So comparing these individuals with other immigrants or descendants of immigrants or with some natives can provide some interesting, perhaps not always as if random, but reasonably clean comparisons to try to make causal claims about culture. So next slide, please. That's pretty much everything I had to say. Of course, in the paper, we review examples, and we are much more formal than this. We also review the limitations, which are many, and we try to really encourage evolutionary human scientists not to use these techniques as a substitute for what, for instance, Dan has shown, sensitivity analysis, control variables, and all of these approaches. Rather, we suggest to also think about these overlooked strategies to complement the toolbox that the researchers already have. So that's about it. Thank you very much, and I pass the baton to the next speaker.
So thank you, Sergio, for the introduction to the method. So I'm here, Lisa Fessler, postdoc at the University of Lausanne, and I'll talk about the following paper. This is a joint work next with Raphael Lalive and Charles Everson, and the idea with that paper is that really would try to demonstrate the causal influence of culture in decision-making domains that are related to fertility and mortality, which are the two basic components of genetic fitness. Next. So many of us are probably comfortable with the idea that somehow cultural differences exist. For example, when we compare behaviors in two different countries, we just say that cultural differences. However, from a strictly empirical perspective, culture often co-vary with many other things, such as the genetic structure, the environment, the weather, the political institution, etc. Next. So separating the effect of culture from this co-found can be often impossible or at least challenging. Next. What would be a much better setting to study that is that if we can find a situation where we have two cultural groups that live in the same environment, have the same institutions, same genetic structure. And that's what we are trying to do in that paper. Next. So we use something called the Röstigraben. Next. Which is a language border that separates French and the German-speaking part of Switzerland, and that for some part does not match with any other institutional boundary. And this language border is also perceived as a strong cultural border by people living on both sides. And there are also documented differences in average behavior of the two groups. However, we know that average differences is not enough to draw any causal inference, so we need another method. And we use a regression discontinuity design that Sergio mentioned. And the idea, the intention with this method is really to compare the simulated behavior at the border, just on the right and just on the left of the border, and compare the distributions at the border. And with this method, we can identify a local but causal effect. Next. Regression discontinuity design requires a quite significant amount of data with a good geographical precision, which is not always easy to find. So we use the reference data, so Swiss people, but many times a year on many different topics, including topics that are related to health and fertility. So data is publicly available, and the precision level is rather good at the municipality level. So we selected and pre-registered 6 different referenda, 3 related to health and 3 related to fertility, to analyze the distribution of the results at the border. Next. Before I go to a specific example, here's a summary of the results. We found multiple discontinuities. Of this significant discontinuities, 1 was related to health and 3 were related to fertility. Next. And I would like to walk through one example next. So in February 2014, the Swiss citizens had to vote to say if they would like to stop the reimbursement of abortion. Next. And so abortion has been legal since 2002 in Switzerland and is reimbursed by health insurance. And some people said we should stop the reimbursed abortion for some moral reason. And so we analyzed the results of that referenda. Next. Next. So here are the results. You have on the x-axis the distance from the Röstigraben. The Röstigraben is our threshold, and what we're interested in is what happens just on the right and just on the left. And you have on the y-axis the percentage of yes vote in each municipality. And what you can see here, if you focus at what's happening at the border, is that you have a strong discontinuity at the border, suggesting that there's, if we assume that at the border only culture vary, we have a cultural difference here. So this is the first step in the study. For each referenda, we analyze if we have a significant discontinuity or cultural effect at the border. In the second step, we discuss somewhat speculatively how this could impact selection on genes. So if we assume that this votation could have an impact on fitness, for example, we know that humans are cooperative breeders, so in that sense, any limitation on women's ability to manage this trade-off could impose a fitness cost on women. If we assume that, and we assume that at the border, one policy was better than the other in terms of fitness, then it means that one of the two groups, whatever the one that be, was ready to impose a fitness cost on some people in the group to uphold some cultural values. Next. So to conclude, next, in the study, we show that culture can create stable differences between groups in domain related to health and fertility, where the cultural explanation were distinct from institutional, genetic, and environmental explanation. Next. And in the second step, we also discuss how these cultural differences could affect the relative fitness of individuals in the two cultural groups. Next. And I thank you very much for joining. I leave the floor to the next speaker.
Okay, thank you, Lisa. And we're going to continue for one more paper with this theme, isolating the causal effect of cultural variation. This is a paper with Matthias Schief, Sonja Vogt, and Elena Chulilova. Matthias was really the driving force. He couldn't be here, so I'm standing in. Next slide, please. Some of you may not know that parents in the South Caucasus preferentially abort female fetuses, especially in Armenia. And they've been doing so since the early 1990s. And you see the dynamics of that here. So it's produced some of the most distorted sex ratios at birth ever observed since the 1990s. Okay. Now this is interesting because the question is this a cultural phenomenon? If it is, it suggests at least the possibility that some past cultural evolutionary process has generated a situation in which parents may not be optimizing the trade-off and investment between female offspring and male offspring, for example. But the trick here is, how do you say this is cultural, right? The change in behavior that started in the early 1990s is strongly correlated with important historical events, so the collapse of the Soviet Union, and it's also correlated with institutional boundaries. You're basically comparing different countries at this point, and as you move from Armenia to Lithuania, for example, a lot of things change. So that's what we're going to try to do here, is attenuate, even if we can't eliminate some of these confounds. Okay, next slide. Before we turn to that, however, I just want to clarify how incredible some of the choices are here. So this is a different paper of ours, and these are contemporary data from Armenia, and I want you to look at that red triangle all the way to the right there. This is the sex ratio at birth for parents who start off with 2 daughters. So this is the sex ratio at birth for the third born child. And the number there is 330 boys to every 100 girls. So to be clear, that cannot happen without really aggressive sex selection. So that's what we're talking about here. Next slide, please. So the question then, is this cultural? Now, to examine this, we're going to do a very simple implementation of the epidemiological approach that Sirio mentioned. We're going to limit attention to the choices of different ethnic groups all living in Soviet-era Russia. So in that sense, that's our strategy, very simple way to try to attenuate these environmental and historical confounds, even if we can't get rid of them. We know there was no sex-selective abortion back then, so we're going to look for an alternative signature of son bias. In particular, we're going to look for differential stopping rules. So an example of this would be you keep having kids until you have a son. And in particular, you do that even if it means you have more children than you would otherwise have. Okay, so that's an example of a differential stopping rule. And we're going to do this because it turns out, to my surprise, there's a 5% random sample of household responses from the 1989 census buried in an archive in Moscow somewhere. So those are the data we're going to be using for this study. And what we have specifically is the sequence of births and the ethnicity of the head of household, and of course where they live, which is going to allow us to limit attention to Soviet-era Russia. What we're going to do is check the probability of having a third child conditional on the ethnicity of the head of household and the sex of the first two children. So that's how we're looking for differential stopping rules. Next slide, please. Here are the results. You see immediately that the Caucasus jump out as different. And what is this graph showing you here? So it's showing you the log odds ratio, so that effectively the probability of having a third child under different conditions. If we look here at the black circle for the Caucasus, that's comparing the probability of having a third child if you start off with two daughters relative to everything else, okay? And this elevated log odds ratio shows you that people are more likely to have a third child if they start off with third daughters. However, it's not simply a preference for having children of both genders. Right? And the green triangle shows you that. So the green triangle is the log odds ratio that addresses the probability of having a third child if you start off with two daughters as opposed to two sons. If all parents wanted was a mix, then this log odds ratio would be 0, but the fact that it's also elevated reveals that parents have a specific interest in having a son, okay? And again, because we're comparing different ethnic groups within Soviet-era Russia, so a common set of institutional and economic conditions, at least that's the idea. The hope is this attenuates, even if it doesn't eliminate environmental and historical compounds. Next slide, please. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Charles. So we come at this from a slightly different perspective. We're both philosophers of biology who think a lot about archaeology and human evolution and methodological issues involved. What we think is that some recent work in the philosophy of science on causation can help shed some light on some ongoing debates about causation when it comes to the evolution of human behavior. Next slide, please. So the particular philosophical theory we're interested in is called interventionism. It's mostly been put together by James Woodward at the University of Pittsburgh. Interventionism understands causality in terms of an intervention. What's an intervention? An intervention on a variable x with respect to variable y is a manipulation of the value of x such that if the value of y is changed, then the change in y only occurs through the change in x. Okay, that's a kind of big mouthful. What does it really mean? Well, intervention kind of asks, are there circumstances in which it's possible to wiggle the value of one variable by wiggling the value of another variable? Now, this is a kind of really minimal account of causation, but what it does is give you this nice kind of starting point, an inclusive starting point where you can start to build up more complex and demanding notions of causality. In particular, what it allows you to do is start to distinguish the different properties of different causal relationships. Next slide, please. So think, say, for instance, you're in a room and you see someone strike a match, and you're in a sort of philosophical frame of mind and you think to yourself, well, what caused the match to light? Now, your sort of first impression is going to be something like, well, it was the striking of the match that caused the match to light, right? But then you think back to your chemistry days and you think, well, it's also the case that if there wasn't any oxygen in the room, the match wouldn't have lit. So that looks like it's also presence of oxygen in the room is also a cause for the lighting of the match. But there seems to be something intuitive that we want to say why we would pick out the striking of the match as the cause for the match being lit over and above the mere presence of oxygen. That seems intuitive to us, but maybe is that just a sort of, striking of matches capture our attention in ways that presence of oxygen doesn't? Is it a merely sort of pragmatic thing or interest relative thing? Or is there objective features of the world that we can pick out to distinguish between those two types of causal relationships? Okay, next slide, please. So interventionism gives you a way of doing that. So if we look at the variable fire at time t, the value of that variable is no. If we look at time t prime, the value is yes. If we look at strike, the value at time t is no. If we look at t prime, the value is yes. If we look at oxygen, the value of that variable at time t is yes. And if we look at t prime, the value is yes. So what this means is that there is a change in the value of the variable strike over time, but there is not a change in the value of the variable of oxygen over time. And the terms we use to pick these differences out are actual difference-making cause and potential difference-making cause. And so there is an actual change in the value of a particular variable, and that is worth noting. Next slide, please. So here's a sort of another way of visualizing the differences. You might have many different causal inputs going into an effect, but one of those, in this case, cause 3, changes over time, and that is your actual difference maker. And that might give you a good reason for picking out that particular cause over and above the other causes. Next slide, please. Now, importantly, what this distinction gives you is it picks out an actual objective change in the structure of the world over time. It's an objective feature of the world that you're picking out there. It's not just a purely interest relative or pragmatic concern. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, that's all well and good. That's the kind of sort of high-level conceptual framework. The big question then is, well, how do you start sort of applying those ideas to actual work in human evolutionary science? What we look at is some of the debates going on about transitions in the early Paleolithic, particular 3 types of explanations that come around regarding transitions in the archaeological record. So they're biological, social, and environmental. So for biological, sort of think of the view put forward by Ignacio del Torre on the origins of Acheulean. There he thinks that the Acheulean is best explained by the appearance of Homo erectus and various sort of cognitive upgrades that come along with that biological change. Next slide, please. On the social, when it comes to social explanations, think of the sort of demographic turn in archaeology. So this is the idea that population dynamics can do a lot of explanatory work when it comes to looking at the sort of complexity of toolkits and transitions in the archaeological record. Next slide, please. And finally, so in particular, Mark Collard has pushed back in particular against the demographic turn. He's very interested and has run with Robin Torrance's notion that environmental pressures have a big causal influence on the complexity of toolkits. And he has sort of vociferously argued against the demographic turn and the idea that that sort of mitigating the risk associated with certain environments is the main causal influence on the complexity of toolkits. Next slide, please. So as you can see, like a lot of these explanations are either in competition with each other, at least the protagonists involved take themselves to be in competition with each other. What we think is it's an important question for these researchers is to sort of identify whether what they're doing is picking out a potential difference maker or an actual difference maker. So I mean, I put in sort of questions. A lot of people are going to think that all of those various causes, biological, social, and environmental, are going to be potential difference makers. I put question marks in there because at least one person, Mark, seems to think that there's absolutely no sort of social influence on complexity in toolkits. But then there's this next question, which, well, okay, is the difference maker you're picking out an actual difference maker? Next slide, please. Now, this is sort of applying the framework is obviously a serious empirical challenge. That's where we sort of hand it over to the empirical researchers about sort of, coming to arguments about whether or not, say, a demographic or environmental is an actual difference maker in the early Paleolithic. But we do want to point out that a failure to distinguish between these two different types of causation can lead to the appearance of competition when in fact there is none. So it may be that one explanation is in the business of identifying a potential difference-making cause and the other an actual difference-making cause. And in that circumstance, there is no reason for those two explanations to be in competition with one another. And next slide, please. That's us.
Okay. Hello, my name is Frederick Hartmann. I'm a professor of computational linguistics at the University of North Texas. This is a linguistics paper that I wrote with Sean Roberts, Paul Vallis, and Rebecca Grolmund. And it's on the causal approaches for testing the effect of humidity on tone. Next slide, please. So there are a few things to know about you need to know about linguistics in this case that sort of helps to make sense of this. In general, in linguistics, we assume that the sounds you make with your mouth are independent of the location where you are, in the sense that everyone on Earth can develop any sound, and this is sort of for cognitive reasons. So essentially, the sounds you make are independent of where you live. And interestingly, there have been some papers, some studies that seem to have found correlations or associations between environmental variables like humidity, altitude, temperature on the sounds you make. Specific sounds usually that are used to or that these studies assume have some mechanistic relationship where humidity facilitates certain sound production. But other studies have shown that, or have suggested that this might be spurious. But none of these studies basically apply a rigorous causal framework. So we set out to gain insights into this by approaching this from a causal viewpoint. Next slide, please. So what this correlational plot here shows basically is just here for illustrative purposes. These are all the features of the sounds we can identify that we can make with our speech organs. Basically, what we can see is there are a lot of correlations going on. So everything is correlated positively or negatively with other things. Also at the very bottom with elevation, temperature, and humidity. So everything is correlated with everything, which means that you can pick out any two and find some correlation, which again underlines the need for a causal framework. Next slide, please. So what we wanted to do was to, as I'm going to say more about this in a second, is to analyze this. So we gathered a data set from one single language family, the Bantu language family. I'll say more about that in a second. And what we looked at was we got the family tree for this family, and then we used a reconstructed stages, and we looked at specifically tones. Tones is a specific linguistic feature that was found to, by some of these studies, to correlate with humidity. So we gathered historical humidity data and historical tones for the Bantu languages, and we applied our causal framework to that. Next slide, please. So why do we do this? Now, when we look at this situation from a causal viewpoint, what causes sound to emerge? Well, language change, sound change. So over time, we change our sounds over hundreds of years. And if actually humidity were a causal factor, it would not be a causal factor and then which just generates or spawns new sounds, but it would essentially be a causal factor that acts through humidity on the emergence of new sounds. So rather than looking just at, okay, what is the distribution of sounds, we'll look at like what is the causal framework through time, and basically we identified several confounding variables, the language, the closeness of language, the contact between languages where you can borrow tones, and then the change in tones as regards humidity. Next slide, please. We built a Bayesian inferential model. I don't actually want to go too deep into this, but we built this model and essentially try to isolate the pure effect of humidity on tone over time, over thousands of years in the Bantu languages. Next slide, please. So the results of our study, and this is just the raw tone effect isolated here. Basically, in this case, as you can see, the posterior in the blue shaded area, there isn't much in the way of an effect. So we can see some slight skew, but in general, once we take all the other effects into account, there is actually no effect there. Next slide, please. So the conclusion that we draw from this is the reason why this is most likely that in previous studies you run correlational analyses where you just compare humidity languages in humid areas and languages in arid areas and just look at them. But we applied the actual causal mechanism, or like something more close to the causal mechanism over time, which when you do this seems to remove that, which suggests that in fact it seems to be independent of where you live, at least whether or not you use tones. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, everyone. And now we'll have a general question and answer session. So we have one question. Please don't hesitate to ask some more. Just remind you, maybe give me the name of who you have in mind with the question. Although I think anyone who has something to say, please feel free to do so. So the first question is for Lisa. It's from Jean Beauvais, and the question is, great talk, thanks. Did you check on how similar the populations are on each side in terms of age, sex ratio, or any other available variable that we would consider as not cultural? Related to that, do you usually run sensitivity analyses and a regression discontinuity design?
Thanks a lot, Jean, for the questions. I think it's really a great question. I had to cut some slides to 5 minutes, and this slide was in the slides I cut. I'm super happy you asked the question, because I think in regression discontinuity design, one of the assumptions is that at the border, everything is continuous, but the variable you would like to check, so but culture. So yes, we did some, we test this assumption on several variables. So you mentioned the age structure, that's something we tested. Also the population density and some economic variables such as the revenue or the taxes, because we can imagine that can influence also the results. So we did this analysis, and some variables were different at the border. So we really look at what's happening at the border, and the population is a bit younger on the French-speaking side and has a bit less revenue than on the German-speaking side. So we controlled for this variable in a Ford model. You asked the questions, variable considered as not cultural, and there's always the questions, for example, the fact that you have a different tax rate, is that cultural or not? So that's why we tested this assumption, and we add this in a forced model as a control, didn't change any results, but we keep the baseline without these controls. So I would say, yes, we tested for that, and it's definitely something you would like to do if you run a regression discontinuity design. For the second question about the sensitivity analysis, yes, but something I would consider less important. For me, it was more important to know what is state of the art I would like to have for my regression discontinuity design, and then maybe do some tests. Didn't change anything, but I would say much more important to check if you have continuous variable at the border rather than the sensitivity analysis. I'm always a bit skeptical when then you play with this bandwidth and pick the one that favorites you. So I would prefer setting the ideal situation and then test, of course, if it's become insignificant. So thanks for the question, Jean. I hope I answered.
All right, thank you. Any other questions? Please fire away. Use some of the ones we already have, Charles. Okay, so I was committed to tolerating the awkward silence, but apparently that's not going to work. Okay, so let me see here. Well, here's a question for Frederick. What is the advantage of a causal inference model in your specific setting over previous approaches?
Yeah. So the main advantage and the main reason why we did this is that in our specific case, pure correlational studies without any causal framework cannot directly address the question in that, as I said, how is this feature tones distributed across areas in the world, humid or arid areas. If I just go out and compare languages in these areas, that completely ignores the actual causal mechanism, which is that languages change over time, and the actual implication of this statement or of this hypothesis, humidity affects whether or not you have tones in a language. That implies actually, though that is only true if you say languages that are spoken in humid areas over time gradually increase the number of tones that they have in their language. So if you just look at this as like taking a slice through the population of languages in a way, you completely ignore the actual causal structure, and the causal approach that looks at it over time comes closer to the actual reason, those mechanistic reason of why these things come about. So in our case specifically, it's not that it quote unquote like just increases precision or adds some more insights, but rather that everything previous has been everything correlational cannot, like, completely ignores a very important part of that mechanism.
Okay, thank you. So here's a question from Patrick Durkee, I think. I can't see, the last name is cut off. But anyway, the question is, can the speakers maybe each recommend one or two of the most important, useful resources, for example, papers they found while learning causal inference strategies? Okay, so that's quite a question. Let's go through in the same order that we gave the talks. Maybe just do that.
Yeah. Okay, cool. I'll take this first then. So yeah, as I said, I've kind of been hanging out with epidemiologists the past few years. So there's a lot of kind of really nice kind of causal work, kind of like foundational stuff, but it's more kind of epidemiology based, but there are still some really nice kind of books and papers on that. One for kind of general kind of causal inference and introduction to DAGs is it's a book by Judea Pearl and some other co-authors. I think it's called like Causality, a Primer, or Causal Inference, a Primer, something like that. That's a really nice book. And there's another one also by Hanan and Robbins called Causal Inference, What If, which kind of has like 3 sections of like increasing kind of complexity and head spinning. But the first section is all about the basics of how you use DAGs and the different kind of like biases you can get. And that's just like really, really useful. So yeah. Hand it to the next person. I'll pop those in the chat as well, just so they're down.
All right, thank you. Sirio.
Incredible question. I would have probably said what if too, but let me take a kind of like a slightly more provocative standing here, and something like, if we want to focus on what we have done in our article, which contains DAGs, but uses mostly the potential outcome framework as a statistical, logical framework to think about causality, then I would probably need to say, if you are coming maybe from a economics, business viewpoint, you would probably take mostly harmless econometrics, very famous book written by Nobel Prize in Economics, Josh Angrist and Pischke. Or if you're maybe more coming from a sociology angle, talking about social sciences, you would probably take the Morgan and Winship textbook, Counterfactuals and Causal Inference, which in a way for me is the missing link, if you wish, between the DAG tradition and the potential outcome tradition at the textbook level. Of course, these are not small sources, so you need to take your time to read them and digest them. But these are good places to start, I guess, if you want to have really kind of a summary that is as understandable as possible while still being incredibly technical and incredibly complete, at least for an introductory guide.
Okay,
So
thank you, Lisa.
I come from the same tradition at Serio, so I would follow up on that. If I have to talk specifically about the RDD, the main reference is Lee and Lemieux, who wrote many articles about RDD, but also updating the procedures and the state of the art. So if you would like to do an RDD, maybe you start with Serio and my paper to have an introduction, and then you look at the technical details in Lee and Lemieux.
Okay, thanks. Maybe you type that out in the chat, Lisa. For me, the same. My introduction was mostly harmless econometrics, and then I went on to the Morgan and Winship book, Counterfactual and Causal Inference, which in my view is a great book. It covers both DAGs and the potential outcomes framework. It even tries to integrate them. It didn't work for me. I didn't see the integration in the end very well, but I'm sure that was my own limitation. It's a great book, so and quite comprehensive too. So
for us, probably the two main, James Woodward's book is called Making Things Happen. He's got a more recent book called Causation with a Human Face. That actually might be more interesting for those of us working in the human evolutionary sciences. Also, Ken Waters has a really great paper called Causes That Make a Difference, and that's a good resource. That's really is the difference making framework is spelled out there.
Yeah, so mine was also Judah Pearl, but it was that was mentioned already. So I'm going to mention something more specific to our research. My co-author actually wrote a paper a while ago on this entitled "Linguistic Diversity and Traffic Accidents: Lessons from Statistical Studies on Cultural Traits." And it's a very interesting study which actually goes into like specifically in with our topic of certain linguistic traits and what if you make correlational studies without causal inference, what wild things can come out, and what sort of addresses the pitfalls of that, and sort of is more of a pitch of why you need causal inference in this field rather than anything else. So I'll also put that in the chat.
okay, thank you very much. I will let everyone type in those references. Adi and Casey, or should we end here, or I don't have any more open questions?
Can. Absolutely, yeah, no worries. I can take it from here. And I will just go ahead and post the rest of those to the chat so everybody can see them. But really quick, on behalf of Cambridge University Press, I want to take a moment to thank Charles, Dan, Sirio, Lisa, Ross, and Frederick. And I think Ron jumped on as well. And I know it's very early in Australia. So thank you all for joining today and for your presentations and for contributing to the journal. Please, everybody who attended, go and check out the collection on cambridge.org/EHS. All the articles you've just heard about are available to read open access. And if you missed any portion of today's talk, we will be posting it to the EHS website as well, so you can rewatch any sections you'd like. You can also give us a follow on X at EHS_journal to hear about any future papers or webinars as well. But thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you. If I could just add one last point, this is just this is a sample of the papers in the collection. Not all of them. There are many more. So please have a look at the whole thing.
Perfect. Thank you, Charles. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.